The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered by regular post to Ronaldo's management office in Madrid, among hundreds of other pieces of fan mail, sponsorship proposals, and administrative correspondence that typically got sorted by assistants who had long ago learned to distinguish between routine business communications and the occasional piece of mail that required personal attention. But this particular envelope, addressed in shaky handwriting that spoke of advanced age and declining health, somehow made its way to the top of the pile, marked for Ronaldo's personal review. Perhaps because the return address listed only Esperanza and a small village in rural Portugal that most people had never heard of, but that reminded his assistant of the humble origins that Ronaldo had never forgotten, despite his global fame and extraordinary wealth. The envelope was thin and worn, as if it had been carried for days before being mailed, and when Ronaldo opened it during a brief break between training sessions, he found 3 pages of careful handwriting in Portuguese. The letters formed with the precision of someone who had learned to write in an era when penmanship mattered, and who was now fighting against hands that trembled with age and illness. The text occasionally wavering, but the words themselves carrying a clarity and purpose that immediately captured his attention and made him set aside everything else he had been doing to focus entirely on what this stranger had taken the time and effort to write to him. "Dear Cristiano," the letter began, using his first name with the familiarity that Portuguese grandmothers reserve for young people they consider part of their extended family, regardless of whether they have ever met them in person. "My name is Esperanza Silva, and I am 87 years old, writing to you from my bed in a small hospital in our village, where the doctors have told me I have perhaps weeks left to live. And I wanted to use whatever time I have remaining to tell you a story that I think you need to hear. Not because you know me or owe me anything, but because sometimes the most important messages come from strangers who have nothing to gain and everything to lose by remaining silent about truths that need to be spoken." Ronaldo found himself completely absorbed by the letter, the outside world fading away as he entered the world of this dying woman who had chosen to spend her limited remaining energy writing to him. And as he continued reading, he began to understand that this was not fan mail, or a request for money or an attempt to gain his attention for personal benefit, but something much deeper and more significant. A final gift from someone who had lived long enough to recognize important truths and was determined to pass them along to someone who might be able to act on them before it was too late. "I have been watching you play football since you were a young man," Esperanza continued, her words revealing decades of following his career from the perspective of someone who had seen enough of life to appreciate not just athletic talent, but character and the choices that people make when they have the power to influence others. "And I have watched you grow from a boy with dreams into a man with responsibilities, and while I have been proud of your success on the football pitch, what has impressed me most is the way you have carried yourself off the pitch, the way you have remembered where you came from, and tried to use your success to help others who are still struggling in the places you left behind." The letter's second page revealed why Esperanza had felt compelled to write. A story that began with her grandson Miguel, a boy who had been born with spina bifida in a rural area where specialized medical care was difficult to access, and expensive treatments were impossible for families living on agricultural wages and government pensions that barely covered basic necessities, let alone the complex medical interventions that could mean the difference between a limited life and full participation in the world that most children took for granted. Miguel was now 15 years old, Esperanza explained, and despite his physical limitations, he had developed an extraordinary intelligence and a passion for engineering that had caught the attention of his teachers, who believed he had the potential to attend university and perhaps even contribute to solving the very medical problems that he had lived with his entire life. But the family's financial situation made advanced education seem as impossible as the medical treatments that could have improved his mobility and independence if they had been available when he was younger. Miguel dreams of designing equipment to help people like himself, Esperanza wrote, her pride in her grandson evident in every carefully formed word. Wheelchairs that can climb stairs, prosthetics that respond to thoughts, computers that allow people with limited mobility to work from their homes and contribute to their communities. But he knows that his dreams are just dreams, unless he can find a way to get the education that would allow him to turn his ideas into reality. And our family has no money for university, no connections to help him apply for scholarships, no way to give him the opportunities that his mind deserves. Ronaldo paused in his reading, recognizing the familiar pattern of exceptional talent trapped by economic circumstances, remembering his own family's struggles to afford the costs associated with pursuing his football dreams, but understanding that Miguel's situation was even more challenging because his potential lay in a field that required extensive formal education rather than the kind of raw athletic ability that could be recognized and developed through sports academies and professional clubs that invested in promising young players, regardless of their economic backgrounds. The letter's third page contained Esperanza's real message, not a request for money or intervention, but something more profound and challenging, a dying woman's reflection on legacy and responsibility, and the ways that successful people could choose to use their influence to create opportunities for others, rather than simply accumulating more wealth and recognition for themselves. And as Ronaldo read her words, he realized that this stranger was offering him a gift more valuable than any endorsement contract or trophy. The gift of perspective from someone who had nothing left to lose, and therefore nothing to gain by flattering him or telling him what he wanted to hear. "I am not writing to ask you to solve Miguel's problems," Esperanza explained, her words carrying the dignity of someone who had never asked for charity and wasn't about to start during her final weeks of life. "I am writing to tell you that there are hundreds of children like Miguel in villages across Portugal and around the world, children whose minds could change the world if they were given the chance to develop their potential. Children whose families love them and believe in them, but cannot afford to give them the educations they deserve. And you have the power to create opportunities for these children, not through individual charity, but through systematic change that could transform thousands of lives." She went on to describe a vision that had come to her during long nights in the hospital when pain made sleep impossible and proximity to death made pretense pointless. A foundation that could identify brilliant children from poor families and provide not just scholarships, but comprehensive support systems that would allow them to succeed in university and beyond. Mentorship programs that would connect them with professionals in their fields of interest, internships that would give them practical experience, and ongoing relationships that would ensure their success rather than simply providing financial assistance and hoping for the best. "You have already done so much good in the world," Esperanza acknowledged, building hospitals and funding schools and helping individual families during their times of crisis. "But I am writing to suggest that you could do something even more important, something that would outlive all of us and continue creating opportunities for brilliant children long after you and I are gone. A systematic approach to finding and nurturing intellectual talent in places where poverty usually prevents it from being recognized or developed." The letter concluded with words that would haunt Ronaldo for months afterward, not because they were critical or demanding, but because they came from someone who clearly understood both the weight of influence and the brevity of life. Someone who had used her final days to challenge him to think beyond his immediate responsibilities and consider the larger impact he could have on the world if he chose to see his success as the beginning of something larger rather than the end goal of his efforts. "I will be dead before you read this letter," Esperanza wrote with the matter-of-fact acceptance that comes from having made peace with mortality. "But Miguel will still be alive, and so will thousands of other children whose potential is being wasted because they were born into families that cannot afford to nurture their gifts. And you will still have the power to change that, to create something that continues long after your playing career ends, something that transforms the lottery of birth circumstances into opportunities for children who deserve better than poverty's limitations on their dreams. She signed the letter simply Esperanza Silva, followed by a postscript that revealed she had been a teacher for 47 years before retirement, that she had spent her career identifying brilliant children and watching too many of them disappear into economic circumstances that prevented them from reaching their potential, and that writing to Ronaldo represented her final attempt to advocate for students she would never meet, but whose lives could still be changed if someone with resources chose to invest in intellectual talent rather than simply athletic ability or commercial potential. Ronaldo read the letter 3 times that first day, then carried it with him for weeks, pulling it out during quiet moments to reread Esperanza's words and consider the challenge she had presented, not just to help individual children, but to create systematic change that could identify and nurture intellectual talent in places where poverty usually prevented it from being recognized. And gradually her vision began to take shape in his mind as something more than just another charitable project, something that could become the most important work of his life, even if it never generated headlines or enhanced his public image. The research phase that followed involved months of consultation with educators, economists, and child development specialists who helped Ronaldo understand the scope of intellectual talent that was being lost to poverty around the world, the systematic barriers that prevented brilliant children from poor families from accessing higher education, and the comprehensive support systems that would be necessary to ensure that providing scholarships actually resulted in successful outcomes, rather than simply moving economic pressure from tuition costs to living expenses and academic support needs that many first-generation university students struggled to navigate without family guidance. 6 months after receiving Esperanza's letter, Ronaldo announced the creation of the Silva Foundation, named in honor of the dying teacher who had challenged him to think beyond individual charity towards systematic change. A comprehensive program designed to identify intellectually gifted children from economically disadvantaged backgrounds and provide them with everything they needed to succeed in university and beyond, including not just tuition support, but housing, tutoring, mentorship, internship opportunities, and ongoing career guidance that would help them transform their potential into contributions that benefited their communities and the world. The Foundation's first scholarship recipients included Miguel Silva, Esperanza's grandson, who was accepted into a prestigious engineering program where he immediately began working on assistive technology projects that combined his personal understanding of disability with his growing technical knowledge. But more importantly, the Foundation represented a systematic approach to finding and nurturing intellectual talent that had previously been invisible to universities and employers who recruited primarily from affluent families and well-funded schools that could afford to prepare their students for competitive academic programs. Esperanza died 2 weeks before the Foundation's public announcement, never knowing that her final letter had inspired something that would eventually provide opportunities for thousands of children whose intellectual gifts might otherwise have remained buried under economic circumstances beyond their control. But Miguel spoke at the Foundation's inaugural ceremony, reading excerpts from his grandmother's letter and explaining how her vision of systematic change had been transformed into reality by someone who had chosen to see his success as a platform for creating opportunities rather than simply accumulating recognition and wealth. The Silva Foundation's work expanded rapidly, developing partnerships with schools in economically disadvantaged areas, creating assessment tools that could identify intellectual talent regardless of educational background, establishing mentorship networks that connected scholarship recipients with professionals in their fields of interest, and tracking long-term outcomes to ensure that investments in human potential actually resulted in career success and community contributions that justified the comprehensive support provided to each student. Years later, when Miguel had graduated with honors and established his own company designing assistive technology that improved lives for millions of people with disabilities, when dozens of other Silva Foundation scholars had become doctors, teachers, engineers, and researchers working in underserved communities around the world, Ronaldo would still carry Esperanza's letter in his briefcase, rereading her words whenever he needed to remember that the most important victories happen not on football pitches, but in the quiet moments when someone with resources chooses in human potential rather than personal glory. When influence is used to create opportunities for others rather than simply accumulating more success for oneself. And when the brief time we have on Earth is spent building things that outlast our individual lives and continue creating possibilities for people we will never meet, but whose contributions to the world become part of our own legacy.